Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on socioeconomic disparities in pollution exposure, new evidence and arising issues, brought to you by CFAIR, the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics. My name is Sean Cash, and I'm a CFAIR board member and the Bergstrom Foundation professor at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. It's my pleasure to be moderating today's webinar. Next slide, please. It's CFAIR's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. And when we demonstrate the value of the profession to these groups, the Council also increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in applied economics. Next slide, please. CFAIR is very happy to be joining forces with the Association of Environmental and Resource Economics, or AERE, to host this panel today to discuss current background on disparities in pollution exposure across the United States and present new evidence on their causes and consequences. Last year in January 2021, President Biden signed an executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad that outlined an ambitious agenda for reducing socioeconomic disparities, including exposure to environmental pollution. Designing efficient policies to meet this goal requires understanding where the disparities exist, where they are most important, and the forces that create them. Next slide, please. Let me introduce you to today's wonderful panelists. Lala Ma is an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Kentucky. Her primary research area lies in the field of environmental economics, where she combines economic modeling with data to estimate the value of environmental services as an input into policy. Next slide. Nick Kumanoff is an associate professor in the economics department at Arizona State University, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and editor of the Journal of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists. His research aims to understand consumer preferences for public goods and environmental amenities from their private market choices. Next slide, please. Our third speaker, Peter Christensen, is an assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. As an applied microeconomist, he studies energy, environmental, public, and urban economics. Peter seeks to understand how public policy and technological interventions can be used to improve environmental outcomes and increase social equity in cities around the world. Next slide, please. Before we start, we wanted to explain how to engage with questions during the webinar to make sure that the audience knows how to reach us. During the webinar, you can put questions to one or all of the speakers by typing in the box in the control display accessed by clicking on the question dropdown, as shown on the slide here, and sending it to the organizer. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to hand the webinar off to Lala Ma, who will start us off. Lala, please go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Sean, for that great introduction. So again, my name is Lala Ma, and today I'm going to talk about some of my work related to environmental justice. So just to start off, so next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so there's an observation in data that disadvantaged groups are disproportionately exposed to environmental nuisances. A large body of literature documents these disparities by socioeconomic status, and so this field has generally been termed environmental justice, or EJ. Next slide, please. So this figure here is a visual example of the evidence behind disproportionate exposure in North Carolina, where many consider is the birthplace of the environmental justice movement. So it plots the fraction of non-Hispanic white in 2010 against the amount of pollution emitted by large polluters. These polluters are identified in a database called the Toxic Release Inventory. And so the circles here denote pollution, where larger circles represent larger quantities of pollution. And the darker areas represent locations where there are higher shares of non-Hispanic white populations. So from a quick glance, you can see a correlation between where the circles are, the sizes of those circles, and where the lighter colored areas are, which are the locations where there are higher shares of minority populations. Next slide, please. We can similarly look at the correlation between income and pollution. So here, darker areas represent areas with higher per capita income. And so here, it would initially seem that polluters are located in the higher income areas. That's not quite surprising, because areas with more pollution also coincide with areas with more economic activity. Next slide, please. If we, however, zoom in to a particular county within the state, you see that these facilities are disproportionately located in the lower income communities within the county. So again, you see this correlation between pollution and income. Next slide, please. So these correlations are important for identifying the existence of environmental injustices. And this is an important contributor to environmental justice issues receiving federal recognition. However, we argue that how the environmental injustices arise is important if we want to try to address these issues with policies. And so we need to move beyond these correlations to understand some of the causes of injustices. So there are many different ways in which inequities can arise, and I'll just describe two mechanisms that have received a lot of attention. Next slide, please. So first, we might see inequitable pollution exposure because polluting firms choose to locate their operations in poor minority neighborhoods. And they might do this because they have discriminatory preferences, or it could be because areas with high minority population shares have also are correlated with the local economic conditions that are favorable for pollution siting. It could also be due to kind of local zoning or regulations. And then the second most common explanation is this idea of household sorting. So households are sorting or moving towards pollution given the distribution of pollution across the landscape. So again, the idea here is that pollution reduces housing prices because it's considered a nuisance or a disamenity. And so this lowers the cost of living in these areas. And since minorities on average have lower income than their white counterparts, minority households would choose to live in these more polluted areas, leading to the observed environmental justice correlations that we see. Next slide, please. So in a working paper with my co-authors, Rainey Lin, who's a really talented undergraduate at Rice University, and Tuan Phan, who's an economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond, we look at the extent to which differing concern or worry about pollution between different racial and ethnic groups might be driving the sorting of minorities towards pollution. And we look for evidence of this using survey data and a national representative sample of people in the US. Next slide, please. So specifically, we're using the Gallup Pulse Social Survey, which gathers opinions on various social, economic, and political issues. And we look to the survey that includes environmental concern or worries conducted annually in March. So these data give us over about 6,000 responses from 2000 to 2020. And so what we do first is to document whether there are differences in stated concern for environmental quality across race and ethnicity. So specifically, the survey says the following. I'm going to read you a list of environmental problems. As I read each one, please tell me if you personally worry about this problem a great deal, a fair amount, only a little, or not at all. First, how much do you personally worry about, and then insert the pollution topic. Next slide, please. So the first environmental topic we look at is air pollution. This figure plots the average degree of worry over air pollution by race over time, so from 2000 to 2020. We see that minority respondents are on average more concerned about environmental quality than white respondents. And so these are going to be the black lines, the peach lines, and the yellow lines. And this is particularly the case for Black and Hispanic respondents. Next slide, please. When we look at pollution of drinking water, we see a similar pattern emerges. So these are unconditional comparisons and worry across different groups. So a question remains whether some of this ranking will still be there, will be the same after we control for differences in socioeconomic characteristics between these different race and ethnic groups, as well as differences in actual pollution exposure. So one example is perhaps minorities are just more worried about pollution because they are more exposed to pollution. So we'll look into this next. Next slide, please. So to do this, we're going to have to account for some additional information. First, the Gallup poll data includes personal demographic characteristics along with the responses to environmental concern. This is going to allow us to control for differences in these sociodemographic characteristics across the respondents. And then we map these survey respondents to PM 2.5 air pollution data, so air pollution in the zip code of the respondent and based on the year of the survey. So this attaches a measure of the actual exposure to air pollution from all sources of air emissions. Next slide, please. So we have two main preliminary findings. First, minorities are significantly more worried about pollution. So this correlation that we find now conditions on income and various socioeconomic factors, as well as pollution exposure. So in other words, we find this when we compare worry about the environment of individuals with the same socioeconomic status and pollution exposure, but different race and ethnicities. And so because of this, we don't think that SES and pollution exposure are really driving the differences in pollution concern that we see. One might also suggest that maybe worry is kind of relative and perhaps minorities are going to be, are just more worried overall. So we try to benchmark our responses or the responses to make them more comparable across groups by controlling for the differences in non-environmental worries of the respondents. So these are other non-environmental topics that the survey included, and also differences in the extent to which an individual is willing to trade off the environment for economic growth. And so with these controls, the correlation still remains very robust. So even if relative worry is part of the story, it doesn't seem like it's going to be the whole story. Next slide. And then given our first finding, we then look at what happens to the observed correlation between pollution and race after we adjust for differences in environmental concern. So our second finding is that when we account for these differences in pollution worry, this actually makes environmental justice correlations stronger. So indeed, an explanation for why we might see EJ is that people are just moving based on their preferences for environmental quality. Minorities might care less about the environment conditional on income, and this leads to disproportionate exposure. If this is indeed the case, then when we control for environmental worry, this should reduce the correlation between race and pollution, but this is not what we find. And so this evidence suggests that the story of different preferences driving disproportionate exposure isn't likely going to be the main driver. Next slide, please. So where does this kind of leave us now? The literature is pretty clear that disproportionate exposure exists. The question of why still kind of remains. And I would like to emphasize that our study can't really pinpoint the mechanism behind disproportionate exposure. It does suggest ruling out sorting based completely and solely on income and different preferences. And so additional work on why minorities might have these higher tendencies to live near pollution, even though they are more concerned over pollution, will be really important going forward. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lala, for your presentation. That was great. I'd like to remind people in the audience that you can submit a question at any time for any of our panelists. Just use the questions input in the control panel on your screen. Now we'll be hearing from Nick Kumanoff. Go ahead, Nick.
Thanks, Sean. Next slide, please. Here we go. When economists study socioeconomic disparities in pollution exposure, we often focus specifically on fine particulate air pollution, or PM 2.5 for short. Lala's talk gave some nice examples of this. Let me start out by explaining why. Next slide, please. Imagine that the gold rocks on this slide are pieces of fine beach sand, and that the big gray tusk is a human hair for scale. The blue balls on top of that hair represent pieces of air pollution particulate matter smaller than 10 microns in diameter. It's composed of things like dust and pollen and mold spores. If you can see those little red specks on top of the topmost blue ball, those are air pollution particulates smaller than 2.5 microns in diameter. These are things like heavy metals and organic compounds that get released into the air when we burn stuff, when we burn coal to generate electricity, when we burn gasoline to drive our cars. PM 2.5. Next slide, please. When we breathe in particulate matter, the bigger particulates, the PM10, tends to get trapped by mucous membranes in our noses, causing irritation and allergies. but the PM2.5 is so small it can bypass mucous membranes and penetrate deep into our lungs. It can also travel along the olfactory nerve and get lodged in our brains. Medical studies in the laboratory, studies of lab rats and other mammals, find that when mammals inhale PM2.5 and it penetrates deep into the body, it causes a wide variety of cardiopulmonary and neurological problems. And epidemiological studies of human beings outside the laboratory have pretty consistently shown that people who are exposed to higher PM2.5 tend to have lower cognition, worse health, and higher rates of mortality. Now, that statistical correlation is partly explained by what economists call sorting, and Lala described in her talk, the idea that healthier, wealthier, smarter people may choose to live in cleaner places. But economic studies have also shown that some of that statistical correlation represents a causal relationship. Next slide, please. This year's Nobel Prize in Economics was given for developing methods that economists use to establish causal relationships in data describing how human beings behave outside of the laboratory setting. And over the past decade, economists have used those methods to demonstrate that higher exposure to PM2.5 causes worse health and lower economic productivity throughout life. During childhood, higher exposure to PM2.5 causes students to have higher rates of absences from school and to do worse on standardized tests. During adulthood, higher exposure to PM2.5 causes job productivity to go down. That's true for manual laborers, like agricultural workers. It's also true for workers who are engaged in high-skill, cognitively intensive tasks. For instance, Major League Baseball umpires tend to make more mistakes calling balls and strikes on more polluted days. Later in life, after age 65, when most people are retired, prolonged exposure to PM2.5 causes them to have a higher risk of being diagnosed with a wide range of chronic medical conditions that reduce the remaining quantity and quality of life. Everything from heart attacks to strokes to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, even Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. And so those are some of the reasons why the Environmental Protection Agency has chosen to regulate PM2.5 under the Clean Air Act. Under the EPA's most recent analysis of the monetary costs and benefits of regulating PM2.5, they find that for the year 2020 alone, the health, mortality, and productivity benefits of reducing PM2.5 under the Clean Air Act were worth over $2 trillion. And about 75% of that big monetary benefit measure is concentrated among people over the age of 65 because of better health and prolonged life. So let's talk about PM2.5 exposure among senior citizens specifically. Next slide, please. I've been studying the causes and consequences of PM2.5 exposure among senior citizens together with my collaborators, Kelly Bishop, Jonathan Ketchum, and Sophie Mathis. Our work is funded in part by the National Science Foundation and the EPA, although all views expressed in this talk are my own. We've been working with a random sample of millions of Medicare beneficiaries. We track these individuals over a 15-year period. We watch them as they age, as they're diagnosed with new chronic medical conditions, and as some of them die. And importantly, we're able to track their exposure to PM2.5 even if they move around the country, if they move for retirement. And so what we've done is use those data to develop person-specific 15-year pollution exposure histories. And I use those data to develop the next series of slides I'm going to show you. Next slide, please. Let me start with some good news. This slide shows that average exposure to PM2.5 went down by about 35% from the year 2000 to 2013 for US senior citizens. The vertical axis here is showing annual average exposure to PM2.5 measured in micrograms per cubic meter. And so it went down from about 13 micrograms in the year 2000 to under 9 micrograms by 2013. Now what I'm going to do is take this trend line and break it out for different socioeconomic groups. Next slide, please. Here, the blue line is constructed for white non-Hispanic seniors, and the orange line is for Black or African American seniors. And so you can see that in the year 2000, the Black or African American group was exposed to a much higher level of PM2.5, about 13% higher than for the white non-Hispanic group on average. You can also see, if you look closely at how the trend lines evolved over this period, that race gap in exposure declined a lot. It went down by about 70% between 2000 and 2013. Now here, I'm focusing on the difference between the Black or African American and white non-Hispanic groups, because that's the biggest race gap that we see in the data. If I were to add lines to this figure for Hispanic or Asian groups, they would be in between the orange and the blue lines, but closer to the blue line. So why did the race gap in exposure decline over this period? Next slide, please. The primary reason was that the EPA started to regulate PM2.5 specifically. Between 2004 and 2005, they designated a large number of counties across the United States as violating the federal standard for the maximum allowable annual average concentrations of PM2.5, and they directed state and local regulators to clean up those dirty counties. Now, those dirty, newly regulated counties had larger shares of Black or African American residents. About 29% of all Black or African American seniors lived in those dirty, newly regulated counties, compared to 18% of white seniors. And that explains why this gap declined. If you look at the pre-regulatory period from 2000 to 2004, you see that the race gap is fairly stable over that period, even though pollution is declining as a whole. After regulation begins, two things happened. The decline in pollution started happening at a faster rate. The decline got steeper, and the race gap started to decline. This was a result of regulation. And we see these same patterns if we look at the pollution exposure gap by wealth or health. Next slide, please. Here, since we don't observe individual wealth exactly, we're using Medicaid subsidies as an approximation to wealth, since the Medicaid program is means tested. So here, the orange line represents the subset of seniors who receive Medicaid subsidies and are less wealthy. The blue line is for those who didn't. And so you can see that in the year 2000, poorer seniors were exposed to higher levels of PM2.5. And again, that wealth gap declines a lot after the EPA started to regulate PM2.5 specifically. Went down by about 70%. Next slide, please. In this picture, we're looking at the difference between sicker and healthier seniors. The orange line is for those who had a relatively large number of chronic medical conditions for somebody of their age: hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, COPD, dementia, and so on. The blue line is for people who had relatively few chronic medical conditions for somebody of their age. And so once again, you can see that sicker seniors were exposed to higher PM2.5 in the year 2000, and that gap got much smaller over the post-regulatory period. Next slide, please. So to summarize, economists have shown that exposure to fine particulate air pollution, PM2.5, causes worse health, lower cognition, and lower economic productivity throughout life. Before the EPA started regulating PM2.5 specifically, we saw that exposure to this air pollution tended to be higher for senior citizens who were sicker, poorer, and/or Black or African American. After the EPA started regulating PM2.5 in the mid-2000s, those exposure gaps got a lot smaller, but they haven't disappeared entirely. And Peter is going to continue to explain what we've learned about how those gaps arise, how they vary across the US, and why they continue to persist in some places. And I'll be happy to take questions during Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nick. I'd like to remind everyone in our audience today that we will have some time for questions and answers after the end of the three presentations. So please do continue to share your questions and comments for the presenters in the Q&A box in the control panel on your screen. Next up will be Peter Christensen. Peter, go ahead.
Hi all, thanks so much for having me today. I'm here to explain and talk about some new research on the role of housing discrimination in explaining the pollution exposure gap. Next slide, please. So as Lala and Nick have explained, economists have been studying the both reduced form observational evidence of higher exposures or an exposure gap across a number of criteria air pollutants between racial groups. And there are two sort of leading explanations for the mechanisms that result in differences and disparities in residential location choice. One primary set of mechanisms, as Lala was describing earlier, involve persistent income inequality between racial groups, or potentially differences in other location preferences that drive residential location choices. But for the last couple of decades, social sciences across disciplines have advanced another possible explanation. This is the racial discrimination thesis. The idea here is that rather than differences in persistent income inequality or other preferences or attributes of a search in the rental or buyer housing market, it could be that different groups have different access to neighborhoods or differential access to neighborhoods with higher or lower pollution exposures. And this is very important for policy because, of course, if housing discrimination directly affects pollution exposures, then public policy should direct those constraints specifically. Next slide, please. The idea here is that discrimination could affect the choice set, that is, the housing options that are available to otherwise equal renters or buyers that are searching in markets across the US. This kind of constraint could distort their sorting behavior even before they have a chance to make choices within the set of options available to them. This has a number of implications. It could directly create or exacerbate the types of gaps that we see across a number of criteria air pollutants in observed data. It could also potentially affect parental investments in child human capital. That is the likelihood that a household moves out of an existing neighborhood with high pollution exposures because that household may be looking at a reduced set of options. It could also, in equilibrium in housing markets, potentially distort public investments in pollution abatement because it could look like individuals from certain groups have lower or higher preferences or willingness to pay for pollution abatement, thereby potentially affecting pollution abatement efforts at the federal level, when in fact it was discrimination that was getting in the way of sorting in these markets. Next slide, please. In a series of recent and ongoing papers with co-authors Christopher Timmons at Duke University and Ignacio Sarmiento at the Universidad de los Andes, we use audit and correspondence experimental methods to test the relationship between discriminatory constraints in reducing access to housing in low versus high pollution neighborhoods. Next slide, please. I'm going to show you two different pieces of evidence, one from the rental housing market and the other from the buyer housing market in the United States. The first research design is focused on using a large correspondence study on a major online housing platform to examine the role of discrimination in affecting access to housing options in the rental market. Here we sample the full set of advertised listings in zip codes that contain at least one high emitting plant as disclosed in the toxic release inventory within 1 mile of a residential neighborhood. We then send inquiries to all of those listings over the course of 3 days, randomizing the racial identity of the prospective fictitious renter using names associated with African American, Latinx, or white groups. We then measure the differences at these different residential locations, the listing locations, in their levels of airborne toxic pollution concentrations at different locations within the zip code that are associated with those different listing addresses. We characterize them in terms of the lowest quartile, the interquartile range, and the highest quartile of ambient toxic emissions. Next slide, please. And then we test for the within listing or within home difference in response to inquiries made about that home at these different levels of pollution within a given market. And what we find is a clear and robust relationship between the level of pollution exposure and discriminatory behavior. In the figure here presented on the left, we see that at locations within the same zip code with low pollution exposure, African Americans and Latinx prospective renters receive fewer inquiries. About 60% have a 60% likelihood of receiving a response to an inquiry made about housing at those locations relative to an inquiry made from a fictitious white renter. We do not see the same reduced discriminatory response, reduced access in neighborhoods in the same zip code at high pollution exposure. Next slide, please. We then dig into these data a little bit more to look at between the two groups that we study. We find the same relationship, whether we're looking at African American versus Hispanic renters in particular, all relative to a white baseline. We also find the same relationship by gender. Next slide, please. We then look at the relationship between this interaction with toxic concentration and a number of other characteristics of these markets, including above versus below average minority share, the different housing in different parts of the rent distribution, and a match sample of housing on all observed characteristics on the platform that we're using. And we find that this relationship between toxic exposures and discriminatory response, while it looks different in different places, holds across all of these different segments of the rental housing market. Next slide, please. In a second study, we make use of the Department of Housing and Urban Development's 2012 paired actor study at the national level, which was conducted across 28 major housing markets. Here we're focused on search behavior for buyers who are working with real estate agents that may be steering certain buyers in one direction or another within a given market. So HUD did a very careful job over in this multi-year project of constructing buyer profiles using dozens of observed characteristics, including household demographics, employment histories, actual financial accounts constructed for their paired actor housing audit. And so what we're going to do is take the data from that audit and examine and look for differences in the steering behavior and its relationship with airborne toxics concentrations, as I just showed you in the last study in the rental housing market, the number of active Superfund sites within 5 kilometers of a given residence that might have been shown to a white African American, Hispanic, or Asian tester, and PM 2.5. Next slide, please. In the case of both Superfund proximity and airborne toxics concentration, we find a statistically significant and important increase in the level of pollution observed at residences that are shown to African American or Asian buyers relative to a white comparison group. We do not find the same relationship in the case of particulate matter. We believe that one possible explanation for this is that particulate matter tends to vary over larger geographic regions, whereas the searches that are conducted in this study occur at a neighborhood scale within just a few census tracts in a given market. Next slide, please. We find that when we look at the sample specifically of mothers who were assigned to these tests, the magnitudes of the disparities become significantly larger. And in fact, large enough to explain the disparity in residential pollution exposures shown in prior work by Janet Curie et al. Next slide, please. To summarize the implications of these findings, we find robust evidence that racial discrimination in the housing market is constraining the location choices of both renters and buyers of color in US cities, that these constraints interact systematically with pollution exposures, particularly airborne toxic pollutants, contributing to gaps in health outcomes that we observe in population level data. We also, this suggests that discriminatory constraints could potentially distort both the level and distribution of public investments in pollution abatement, which are based on revealed preferences estimates that many of us in the research community are producing, but without properly accounting for the role of discrimination in search. And finally, this suggests that effective enforcement of fair housing policy and other anti-discrimination policies in the housing market may be important for achieving meaningful and sustained impacts on the disparities in pollution exposures that we're interested in today. Thank you very much.
Word of thanks to our partners. This and other Seafarer programming wouldn't be possible without the continuing support of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's National Agricultural Statistical Service, as well as the Department's Economic Research Service. And a special thank you to the Association of Environmental and Resource Economics, AERE, for co-sponsoring today's webinar. AERE board member Margaret Walls has been really helpful in guiding our programming for the past year. And a special shout out to Nick Kumanoff, one of our presenters today, for helping to pick the topics and speakers that we've enjoyed in our panel today. Next slide. And of course, a thank you to all of our panelists. And finally, to our audience. We're passionate about this subject, and we think that you are too, but we know that it's no small thing to give up an hour of your time to spend it with us today. We hope you enjoyed this event as much as we enjoyed hosting it. I'm Sean Cash, joining you today from snowy Boston. Thanking you all for being here. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.